begin, I think it's useful when somebody writes a book to look at two questions. One, what motivated you to write it? Because I'll tell you something, when you write a book, it's work at 3 in the morning, you're carrying another job, and it's intense. And second of all, what did you learn that you didn't know when you started? So those are the two issues I'd like to discuss today, and then we'll have time for questions as well. Question, why did I write this book? What was the sort of motivation? What was the furnace that kept me going to start this enterprise? It really goes back to Camp David in the year 2000 when President Bill Clinton hosted Prime Minister Ehud Barak and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat to a negotiating session that lasted days, and the effort was to put an end once and for all to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Ambitious, the military experts in Israel didn't believe or believed that the gap between the parties was unbridgeable, but nonetheless, the conference was held. I'm not getting into the negotiating positions, they're all laid out in the book, both in the introduction and in the chapter on diplomacy. But what struck me, and I think struck many others, was the assertion made by Yasser Arafat towards the end of the summit that the Temple of Solomon, the second temple that was built during the Second Jewish Commonwealth, never existed. President Clinton went over that assertion repeatedly when he discussed Camp David on various subsequent occasions, and they were leaked to Newsweek and other places, how he was shocked and surprised by this assertion. This could have been an issue that just rose and fell because Arafat, and I've had many hours with Yasser Arafat, was a person who would always put forward sort of wild assertions to throw off people he was negotiating with. But this notion of temple denial didn't die with Arafat. I saw it spreading. I noticed that there were seminars held in the United Arab Emirates to discuss the same theme. Seminars held also in Jordan, in Yarmouk University, looking again into this whole notion of temple denial. I saw links forming that were fascinating and ironic between people with a more, let's say, fundamentalist Islamic perspective who engaged in this activity, and academics from European universities who, for their own ultra-secular reasons, did not want to believe in the veracity of the Hebrew Bible. So the whole notion that Arafat started didn't seem to draw to a halt with Camp David and the Tava negotiations. It continued percolating and spreading. Harper's Magazine had a March 2002 magazine cover, not called New Testament or not called Old Testament, but called False Testament, which picked up this theme of the veracity of the Hebrew Bible being in question. So it was like a germ that was generated at Camp David, and it seemed to be spreading slowly but surely around the world. And I think for Arafat, it was actually a certain amount of political genius, because if you're battling the Israelis over such issues as the future of Jerusalem, why not undermine their self-confidence and the confidence of the world in the veracity of their claim? Why not leave them as a kind of colonial movement of Europeans who came in the late 19th century and early 20th century into what had been only an Arab political space, and that way obtain your ultimate political goals? So the book really began with my own need to state the record of our ancient history. And perhaps one of the most enjoyable parts of writing this book were the opening chapters. Not only the introduction, which touches on this, but also the chapters on the Jewish, Christian and Islamic connections with Jerusalem. About the same time that I was considering writing this book, I met up with an Islamic scholar who I shall leave nameless for a variety of reasons. And he was outraged by the spread of temple denial. By the way, as I say in the book, it wasn't just Arafat among the Palestinians. It spread to Yasser Abu-Rabo, it spread to Saeb Erekat, it spread to all the stars who were appearing on CNN and Fox television to expand on the justice of the Palestinian cause. And they were serious about it. Nabil Shah, Wharton, talking about temple denial. I mean, come on. And finally, and unfortunately, Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen. I would find when I had contact, by the way, just going off a little bit on the side, with some senior politicians in the Arab world, and if they were asked point blank, well, what do you think about the veracity of the temple story of the Bible? They would start getting nervous and moving in their seats and not wanting to commit to the veracity of the biblical narrative, and not wanting, of course, to openly say something in support of Arafat's assertion. So you can see that this whole, the circles of impact that we're developing. So anyway, going back, I had contact with an Islamic scholar who said to me, Dore, this whole phenomenon is disturbing from an Islamic perspective. And I said, why? And this gentleman took out old Qurans for me, and we opened up Surah 17, and in my broken Arabic, we studied together the commentaries on the Quran. There's the Jalalain, there's the Baidawi, and it looks just like a page of Talmud, by the way, with the commentaries along the side of the text. And when you study the famous verse of praising God, whose prophet, I'm not quoting the verse in exact terms, I'm paraphrasing it, went from the holy mosque to the farther mosque, and the interpretation of the meaning of farther mosque is raised. Well, in all the commentaries, that's Beit al-Maqdis. What is Beit al-Maqdis? So anyone who also knows a little Hebrew knows. It sounds like Beit HaMikdash. And Baidawi, of course, adds the assertion, or his commentary, his understanding in the commentary. Since there was no mosque at the time, it had to be Beit al-Maqdis. That is where Muhammad's nocturnal journey, that was the destination of Muhammad's nocturnal journey. So even from the standpoint of the study of Quran, these wild assertions of temple denial seem to conflict with Islamic traditions. But nonetheless, they were very popular. So one of the things I do with this book is I go back into the world of archaeology, into the materials that are collected, and probably put as much work running around museums trying to get those color pictures for the first section as I did writing the text. One of my friends who has a lot of business connections in the Gulf countries, particularly in Saudi Arabia, said to me, not only is it they don't believe in the temple, what's now starting to spread is there was no ancient kingdom of Israel. Kingdom of Judah, made up. And there were, of course, academics you can find in the West who will say, oh, there were only priests who came around in the Maccabean period who invented this whole history to justify their status later on. So this was a convenient marriage of intellectual perspectives that you would find. Of course, what I did find, and I put in the book, Fight for Jerusalem, are some extraordinary archaeological finds that occurred recently. Some of them go back even more than 50 or 60 years. One, of course, is a plaque that was put on the Temple Mount originally, written in ancient Greek. And it was directed during the Second Temple period to non-Jews. People don't know this, but the practice of offering sacrifices on the Temple Mount was not confined just to Jews. Non-Jews could also offer sacrifices. In fact, many times, kings of the ancient Near East would ask that a sacrifice be offered in their name or in their honor. And so you had a warning plaque in Greek. This is the temple area. Be careful where you walk. There's certain areas where you're not supposed to walk. So here is a testament outside of the Bible, written in ancient Greek, saying this is the temple area. Now, that full plaque exists in Istanbul, and I wasn't going to try and get permission from the Istanbul Museum to use it, but a piece of it exists in the Israel Museum, and that appears in my book. For those who doubt the existence of the ancient kingdoms of Israel and Judah, we also have in the text, in the photographic section, royal seals of kings mentioned in the Book of Kings. Like Hezekiah, his actual royal seal that was found. Or King Ahaz, another king of Judah from the Davidic line. There it is, not made up, not something invented. Part of temple denial also stretched into the area into David denial. And there were people who first said, well, there's no proof that King David or King Solomon really existed. By the way, both of them are mentioned in the Quran. Dawood and Suleiman. But let's leave that aside. There was a lot of David denial until in 1993. A rather revealing stone was found in Tel Dan in northern Israel. And on this stone was written in ancient Aramaic records of a battle between the king of Syria and the king of Damascus, and the king of Israel, and yet another king where it's erased from the line of David, from the house of David. It says house of David. So, of course, that stone is now in the Israel Museum, and it's replicated in my book. So those who were into David denial for many years, up until 93, someone came up with a new line. They said, well, maybe David was a village chieftain. So, you have this imagery, village chieftain, somebody who lived in a thatched roof and had an empire, about the size of a quarter of a borough in New York. I mean, something very tiny. The importance of that was that those who said that he was a village chieftain meant that he was incapable of monumental structures, like palaces, like a temple, until about a year ago, when a person who I sought advice from for writing this book, Eilat Mazar, the archaeologist in Israel, discovered an extraordinary structure in the area of the city of David, right south of the Temple Mount. And what was extraordinary about this structure is it could be dated by pottery to the era of King David. And rather than being something like the foundations of the thatched hut, it had walls that were 8 feet thick, suggesting monumental architecture at the time of King David was being built. Now, the structure that was found, this foundation that was 8 feet thick, didn't have a sign on it, careful, this is the palace of King David, although Eilat Mazar and her archaeological staff thinks it might actually be the foundation. It was on the front page of the New York Times, if that matters in this discussion. The point is that there is an enormous amount of archaeological evidence that seems to support the biblical narrative and not Arafat's narrative in Camp David, and I felt it was important for me to bring that forward in the first part of my book. Now let's talk about what I learned and what I didn't really look for originally, what I didn't anticipate. The book is written with, I think, tremendous respect towards the different faiths, towards Christianity, its connections with Jerusalem, which have their ups and downs. You read the New Testament, and with Islam, because there are surprising aspects I will go into later about how classical Islam dealt with Jerusalem and dealt with the connections of other faiths to Jerusalem that somehow have been lost upon many of the more popular clerics that now are in the internet that are affecting the spread of radical Islam. But setting aside now the classical connections of different faiths, I was interested in understanding how radical Islam viewed Jerusalem. There is in Israel an Islamic movement that has a northern branch and a southern branch. The northern branch of the Islamic movement is headed by a man named Sheikh Raed Salah, who was a prison in Israel for a period of time. And when he left prison, he suddenly put forward this interesting assertion. He said, Jerusalem will be the capital of the new worldwide caliphate. And I was wondering, where did he get this? What was he reading when he was in prison? What books? What do we know? And I could never figure out where his assertion came from. The Islamic movement, certainly the northern branch, comes out of the Muslim Brotherhood. So if one is wanting to trace the sources of this intellectual thesis, it would be interesting to look at what the literature of the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan or in Syria is saying. And of course in Egypt, where the Muslim Brotherhood originally was established. I didn't get an answer to this, but I was one time sitting with a security official from an elderly gentleman from our security services in Israel. And he said, if you want to understand the significance of Jerusalem's radical Islam, study Khaybar. I said, Khaybar? And, I took one of my analysts who used to be in Israeli military intelligence, and I said, well, let's do Google search in Arabic. Khaybar and Jerusalem. And let's see what we come up with. Anyway, we did a lot of research on this. Khaybar, you should know, was a village in northern Arabia in the 7th century. After Muhammad had left Mecca and moved to Medina with his followers, he was sort of stuck there for a period of time, and his ability to spread the Islamic faith seemed to not be going very far during that period. Then there was the Battle of Khaybar. Khaybar was a village, rather well-to-do village. Basically, people who lived there were mostly Jewish. Northern Arabia was one of the routes, if you wanted to go from the land of Israel, Palestine, to Babylonia, to the area of Baghdad. You either went the northern route through Syria, or you went the southern route across northern Arabia. So there were many Jewish villages in northern Arabia, including Yathrib, which later became Medina. So anyway, Khaybar was attacked by Muhammad's forces. It was defeated. The Jews weren't killed. They had to pay a certain tax to the new Islamic authority in Medina under Muhammad. And it became a model for how to deal with non-Muslims. But what was interesting is that right after the fall of Khaybar, Muhammad succeeds in conquering Mecca. And once Mecca is conquered, and of course Muhammad dies shortly thereafter, the early caliphs begin Islamic expansionism out of the Arabian Peninsula, defeating the Byzantines and the Persians. So that Khaybar is perceived by some as a pivotal battle. The defeat of the Jews of Khaybar opens up eventually the conquest of Mecca and the great jihad, the world conquest. And this was a theme which we began picking up. Interestingly enough, you should know, in the last war in Lebanon, the Second Lebanon War, Hezbollah had an Iranian rocket, which they called the Khaybar 1. So Khaybar seems to haunt the language and terminology of radical Islamic groups. Well, this was all relevant for only one reason, because what I started understanding when we looked at some of the sources that we were collecting was that for radical Islamic groups, obtaining Jerusalem is the first step for launching a new global jihad. That's what seems to emerge. And it emerges both among Shiites, among literature we found of Hezbollah, and it emerges among Sunni radicals as well. There is, in fact, a kind of secret militant army which is supposed to help the Mahdi in the future, the anointed one, fight the Antichrist, what in Arabic is the Dajjal. And this little secret group, it's called Taif al-Mansura, according to Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi, the spiritual head of the Muslim Brotherhood, appearing on Al Jazeera, this force is already in place. That's what he said in an appearance of his in 2002. So for those who follow a more radical Islamic line, who begin to adopt apocalyptic scenarios towards the future, the end of times is not something that occurs sometime in the future, 2,000 years, Jerusalem has a more important role. In classical Islam, Jerusalem is the third most important religious city, holy city. And there is a literature in Islam which sort of warns against over-venerating Jerusalem. Ibn Taymiyyah was the great author of this in the 13th and 14th century period, when Ibn Taymiyyah warned that over-venerating Jerusalem is sort of borrowed from Judaism. The Muslims should not practice practices that are reserved for Mecca in Jerusalem. But when you're talking about the end of days, when you're talking about apocalyptic scenarios, which have become far more popular in the Arab and Islamic world in recent years, Jerusalem's importance rises. Now, what does that mean for the present tense? It means several things, and I'll wrap up this. Unfortunately, there is a thesis in foreign policy circles that if you want to lower the flames of radical Islam, if you want to deal with this threat which all the world has been facing, one of the instruments that exist in the hands of the Western Alliance is to get the Israelis to withdraw from territories which have been disputed since 1967-68. Withdrawal will lower the flames of radical Islam. Now, this can be contested without any relationship to Jerusalem by looking at our experience in getting out of Lebanon, which I supported, or getting out of Gaza. The last war which we had, which was really a two-front war, the last war that Israel experienced, which was a two-front war, was launched against Israel from territories from which Israel withdrew. Hamas was launching Qassam rockets from the Gaza Strip. Many of us expected that when Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza, we would see an escalation in the West Bank, and Gaza would be quiet. And from Lebanon. In Lebanon, the Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon was basically verified by the United Nations Security Council. And yet, these areas from which we withdrew were areas from which we were attacked. And rather than lowering the flames of radical Islam, one could make the argument that each withdrawal elevated the flames of radical Islam in the Eastern Mediterranean area, not on a worldwide basis, one can't prove it. But I would suggest that, let's say Israel lost its nerve, and let's say an administration came to power that said to the Israelis, you know what, our vital interests are at stake. You have got to get out of the vast majority of the West Bank tomorrow, and an arrangement will work out, and give the Palestinians the neighborhoods where the Palestinians have a majority in Jerusalem, including three-quarters of the old city. In my judgment, rather than lowering the flames of radical Islam, we would shoot them up to unprecedented heights. And in my book, this is described in detail. I think many foreign policy assumptions that are part of the discourse on television, on those Sunday morning talk shows, are untested. And if I had to talk about something I learned, and I had no idea I was going to get into this when I wrote the book, The Fight for Jerusalem, it was that this danger exists. And there's a real need to carefully examine the connections between the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the wider war on global terrorism. Because there's a lot of counterintuitive connections. People think that somehow by dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, deal with the wider war, in fact that whole thesis can lead to a foreign policy that would backfire. That is one of the strongest themes that emerges in my book. There are many other sub-themes, there are many other issues that surface in the text that, if you read the book from beginning to end, you will find. But I think what emerges from this is that those who are analyzing the Arab-Israeli peace process, or those who are looking at questions about radical Islam, what feeds it, what makes it withdraw, have to re-examine their assumptions. I will leave you with one other more philosophical point. If there's an error about analyzing radical Islam that's very common, I find when I lecture in the United States or in Great Britain. It is the assumption that radical Islam grows from a political grievance. Now, there's some political grievance out there. Bosnian Muslims have been mistreated. There's a problem in Central Asia with the Russians. There's a problem with the status of Kashmir. And if you address these political issues, the number of volunteers who will come to join radical Islamic movements will decline. What I concluded in looking at this work, in my earlier work on Saudi Arabia, Hatred's Kingdom, is that radical Islam does not feed off of a political grievance that you can address with diplomacy. It feeds off of a sense of victory. When was Al-Qaeda formed? When something happened in relationship to political grievances? When the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan. When Osama bin Laden and his supporters among the Arab Mujahideen in Afghanistan sat together and said, we just defeated a superpower. We're replicating the 7th century of Islam. I'm not sure how accurately they were replicating, but that's what they believed, that's what they perceived. And therefore, if you want to feed radical Islam, if you want to spread the flames of jihadism, hand them a victory. If you believe wrongfully that Israel addressing the political concerns that you define here sitting in the United States, of various Arab states or the Palestinians, will somehow lower those flames, it won't work. And if you touch Jerusalem, which, by the way, was never a big interest of Osama bin Laden, but if you touch Jerusalem by mistakenly thinking you're going to address the problems of radical Islam, it's going to backfire on you, and you're going to deal with a much more dangerous reality than you could have ever imagined.